Hey guys, right, welcome back to another video. So in this one we're going to be fitting an M50 manifold to an M52, and I'm going to be going through with a sort of detailed write-up as to how to fit it and any tips or tricks to help you with installation and removal. So just a quick look at the manifolds. That's your standard M52 manifold. It comes on the 2.5s, 2.8 M52s, single Vanos. And this is the M50 B25 manifold. It's the same on the non-Vanos engines and the single Vanos M50s. The 2 litre manifold is smaller, so you don't want to use that one. You specifically want a 2.5 M50 manifold. You can verify this by checking the part number and notice that it ends 25. Just down here. So now we verified that's the right manifold. That's the first port of call. As you can see, there's a few differences. The M50 doesn't really use a breather system like the M52 does. The M52's got like a proper oil separator. There's a couple of ways of doing this. There's some kits that used to exist, but in 2024 your choices are a little bit limited because the support these days is pretty non-existent. But the long and short of it is we're essentially going to use the M50 style breather system to retrofit onto the M52. So we do away with this stuff, simplify the setup, and basically just use a catch can externally on the engine for crankcase fumes, etc., from the rocker cover. So we'll simplify that. Anyway, first things first, let's get into removing our manifold. This is a spare one I've got, but we're going to show you how to remove that from the engine first and foremost, and then we'll come back to the setup. Get the airbox off, all the MAF, throttle body stuff, and start disconnecting shit to just go crazy. So first things first, airbox, a couple of 10mm, just loosen them off. And then you've got to undo the MAF plug that just twists anti-clockwise. You've got a couple of these little clips here for your airbox. Just pop them out with a flathead. And then you should be able to pull that airbox up in a moment. There's also a couple of Jubilee clips here holding your intake boot on. Right, and then that's out of the way. So this whole airbox lifts out. Dead easy. Take our alternator cooling duct off. Again, Jubilee clip down here. Shelob definitely lives in this engine, mate. So just pull it off our cooling duct here and then wiggle it up from this, and that's off. Next up, just going to work through the take this other intake boot off, or the Jubilee clip on the other side. This intake boot is absolutely shagged.
Oh, fuck, you have to have arsehole.
Yes. And that's your intake boot off. This one obviously needs replacing, if you can't tell. There's a couple of things to mention about that, we'll chat about later. So next up, you've got the, bring you in a bit closer, you've got your traction control throttle body, and you've got your actual intake manifold throttle body. Now if you go for your M50 manifold, you're probably tuning the car for performance. You probably don't care about traction control. You can bin this whole assembly off. So to do that, unplug this guy. You're going to remove your cable here, remove these two screws here, or bolts here, that comes off. And then you can undo the bolts that hold this intake manifold throttle body on, bin this bracketry, and then put your bolts back in. So you can bin that off, and then with this throttle body intake boot, get rid of this because this is the M52 one, and you can go for an early M52 throttle body, which is slightly longer and basically takes up this space where the traction control throttle body is. So that's what I would do. Whether there's any performance gains to be had, I don't know, but you're removing this flap, which I guess is some kind of restriction. So it's a winner-winner in my book. And who wants traction control anyway? Not me. So you've got these little 10mm. That's the second one out. And then we're going to free this traction control throttle cable thingy. Just release the cable that way, and then that whole thing comes off. So that's ready to go in the bin. You've got this little rubber boot thing, again bin that, and then pop this throttle potentiometer, or whatever it's called, I don't know what it's called, off. And then you've got your 4 10mm holding the main throttle body on. Right, so now that piece, if you've been in your traction control, you can bin that as well. These bolts are fine to reuse to bolt the throttle body back down, so we'll save those. So at this point we can move the throttle body away from the car. We don't actually, what do we want to do now? Yeah, we can just chuck that out of the way for now. You've got a couple little gubbins and stuff. This box here, if you unplug this, you'll get a light on your dash for DSC or traction control, whatever. If you leave that plugged in, you won't get any lights after removing the ABS traction control. Next up, you got your purge valve. Just pop that up out of the way.
Purge valve?
Purge valve, yeah.
In my way.
Standard stuff. The carbon canister plastic bit snapped off because it's brittle, but the purge valve I've bin anyway, along with the carbon canister. So we don't need that. But what we do want to keep, there's a blue hose that goes to it. So we're just going to leave that in the engine bay, but we can remove the whole carbon canister. Couple of 10mm bolts, again we don't need those. And then there'll be a small fitting on the bottom, so we can bin that off, that's not needed. There we go, and then that's most of the charcoal system dealt with. What you're going to do is basically just leave this blue wire, you can cut it, or blue, it's basically a tank vent. You can just cut that short and leave it cable tight down there out the way. I think it's something to do with stopping the tank over pressurising, but yeah, as long as that's tucked down there. You can brim your car full of fuel, you don't have any issues with leaks or anything like that. It's never caused me an issue, so yep, just leave that sat in the engine bay. And now next up we can actually focus on the intake manifold. So first of all, get this vanity cover off, pop our clips off there. And then that's our vanity cover off. So there's a few bits to disconnect up the top. First you've got these O2 sensors. I'm going to pop them off out of the way. You can actually disconnect them all together. He says. And then you've got the fuel rail, a couple of 10mm there and there, and then you've got this CCV breather hose, squeeze that in, pull that off, and then the Vanos solenoid electrical plug with there, which is a push clip and pull down. Right, so fuel rail is almost ready to come out. Now we need to make a bit of room, because if we pull the fuel rail out, it will just get stuck on this gear at the back. So pull this rubber trim off, release our throttle cable, and then underneath this little thing here, there's a couple of Phillips screws just in there. So we want to undo those. There's one either side, one there somewhere, and then that will hang down. Oh, there's a random hand. Hi. That's the glamorous assistant, because we're also doing a manual swap on this one. So whilst he's under there getting covered in shit, I'm on the top taking the manifold off. So yeah, killing two birds with one stone. But basically, if we whip these two screws out, this will pull down, and then we can remove. There's this basically rain shield, I don't know what this proper name is. We can pull that up and out, and then that gives us loads more room for removing the manifold and gubbins, etc. And the little Phillips screws, You've got to be a little bit careful because there's not actually an access port. The only way you can physically undo them is by bending this up. If you break this, it's not the end of the world, but obviously if you need to replace it, they are a BMW only part. I think they're about 60 quid from the dealer. And now we want to pop off. We've got these little bolts here, I think they're 7 or 8 mils. You've got one that side and then 2 that side, one there, one slightly further down. Down there, you just about see it. Yeah, 7 mil. Hopefully you get in there and they aren't rusty, because when they rust out they're a bugger to remove because the heads get so corroded. So now this whole thing should lift up, so you basically need to wiggle it and it should come up and over. They can be pretty tricky. If they've not been off before. There we go. Also, it's a real good idea to clean this out, because what happens is this fills with dirt and crap, as you can see this one is, and then it rots the bulkhead, and then that's sometimes where you get water ingress into coupes and convertibles and tourings and saloons as well. But yeah, what that allows us to do is just then move this loom up slightly higher to get the fuel rail and the bolts and stuff for the intake manifold. So that's your brake booster fitting. These clips I tend to just bin and replace with a Jubilee. They're like a single use really. So bin that, have a Jubilee ready to replace it. Get that out of the way. So next up we're going to pop the fuel rail out of position. You can either just remove the clips off your fuel injectors and then pull up, or you can remove all of the fuel injectors from the intake manifold. Completely up to you. My preference is usually to try and remove the clips because we need to swap this. We can pull these out the manifold later, reinstall them to the rail before we put them on the M50 Mani. If you pull them up on the rail, because the rail we're not going to fully remove, you could damage the tip, so probably just pull these clips off. Yeah, so you've got these little clips, you just pry them off, so 6 of those. So now you want to just pry up your fuel rail away from the injectors. Just be a little bit careful not to damage anything, but yeah, if you pull straight up, there we go, and then that's the rail off. You will get a bit of residual fuel sort of appearing, don't panic, it's only a small amount. And then chuck that to one side. There is still an electrical connection on the injector rail down there. Right, yeah, you've got an electrical connection down there, so just be careful with that. But yeah, your injectors can live there for the moment, so they're out the way, and then this fuel rail can go to the right, and we can get at the intake manifold bolts. So you've got a selection of bolts, they're all 11 mils. So whip these off. And that's our last bolt out. So now this side's free. What I would suggest is before you pull this off, if you've got access to an airline, smash an airline down there just to clear the worst of the crap, because there will be all sorts of detritus. Now we need to turn our attention to the intake manifold. So there's a few bits and pieces that we need to address. So I'm just going to whip off these coolant lines to the throttle body, so we can get the throttle body up out of the way. You can, if you're in the UK and a hotter climate, you can actually loop these lines, stop your throttle body having hot coolant going through it. You just need to find some sort of joiner.
Why can't you do it if you're in the UK?
So you can do it if you're in the UK.
Oh, I thought you said you can't.
No, I think if you're in like Scandinavia, I probably wouldn't.
Well, what's wrong with Scandinavia?
It's too cold in winter. Right now all this is free. we basically just need to get underneath it and free off. There's a selection of bolts. There's a few 10mm and stuff. I can't remember exactly what order you need to take them off. You don't need to take them all off, but some of them you need to get off. I think there's one here, one at the back that holds the dipstick on, and then there's bracketry that holds it to the block lower down. In there you can see where my 13mm socket is, somewhere there. There's a couple of them that hold the bracket to the block, and then obviously it joins up to here. So essentially just need to get at those bolts and start to break it free and see what happens. But yeah, we'll attack them now. Yeah, so I think we should be able to lift it up. Can't really remember, let's just try it. Obviously be careful not to break anything as this is coming out. Electrical connections. So our fuel regulator hose, vacuum hose, and then there's another hose there, which I can't remember what that one does. And our purge valve. There we go. So that's the intake manifold off. So you can see down there, this is where your fuel lines clip into. So you basically just force that along with your hand, that will come open, and then yeah, the rest is vacuum hoses. So now I'll show you what we're going to replace, what pieces need to be updated, what we're going to bin, what we're going to lose. So that's how you remove it. So 15-20 minutes, not too bad, and then that's what you're left with. Obviously at this point get some gloves or something stuffed down those holes because you don't want anything dropping in there. And we've got a few bits and pieces we need to have a look at and freshen up. Okay, so now we've got the manifold off. We've got a little bit of work to do under here before we go too far. So you don't have to do this, but something I like to do on all the cars I work on is remove the coolant lines to the throttle body. You don't need to buy any parts to do this. It just stops the hot coolant going through the throttle body. The whole idea of that is that the coolant is supposed to stop the throttle body like freezing up or condensating in very cold weather. Obviously in the UK it's not a problem for us. So if you're in Scandinavia or something like that where the weather gets very cold, if you use a car in winter, this might not be a good idea. But for the UK, it's something I like to do. So all you're going to do is you've got this line, the big long one, and then this little short one. All we're going to do is undo this Jubilee, bin this line, and then this hose here is just about long enough. We can cut this shorter and just put that on there, and there's enough loop. It's not really under a great deal of tension or anything like that, and that will work fine. Also, just to note, this fitting here is like a brass fitting. This is a pretty common area for an M52 to have a coolant leak from. So if you've got a very, very slow coolant leak, that's an area where you would want to check, as well as the coolant flange on the back of the head. Just check for any sign of sort of coolant marks. Usually it leaves sort of a crystallized sort of trail of where it's leaking. So, but yeah, worth checking them. Anyway, so we're going to loop that, we'll get that done. And then also, because we're not going to run a crankcase ventilation system on it, what we want to do is block this oil return to the dipstick. So there's just a rubber hose there. We're going to put a bung or a bolt or something like that in there. You don't really need to seal it perfectly, because for oil to come up to here you have to roll the car over. So yeah, as long as we can get a decent size fitting bolt in there with a Jubilee, that'll be fine. So the whole idea of that is you've got this crankcase separate, and it separates the fumes from the crankcase, basically splits the oil and the vapours. So the oil goes back to the sump using the return, and then the vapours, in theory, go back into the intake manifold, and they're supplied by the rocker cover breather. So if you leave this system in there, essentially what happens is the intake is then breathing in dirty, oily air rather than just clean, fresh oxygen. So my theory is, with the rocker cover, vent this to a catch can. It must be an open vented catch can. Remove the oil separator, obviously block this up, and then block the return to the sump. So then that way you should be getting less moisture in your dipstick tube, because quite often these block up full of moisture and like mayo. And also your intake is then getting cleaner air all the time, rather than getting like an oily, vapory residue of air and crap going in. So anything we can do to clean up the intake is a win in my book. So yeah, that's the way I like to go about this. So yeah, we're going to loop these coolant lines, we're going to block that T-piece, and then we can get on to setting the manifold up ready to go back on the car. So first things first, remove that hose because that's now redundant. There we go, taking about that much off. Obviously make sure you've got a Jubilee clip to go back on there. And then that's sort of how it ends up routed. Look, if you really wanted to, you could buy a nice hose and just bridge a right angle, but that's not cost us anything. Right, and then just grab yourself any old bolt, and we are going to seal off the oil return. So make sure you've got a little Jubilee clip to go on there. Smash a bolt in. Probably don't need a Jubilee clip, but you know, we've got one to hand. There we go, and then that's the return blocked. So bolt in there, Jubilee clip, and a little cable tie to stop that moving. So dipstick's all good. So now we can get onto the intake manifold. So let's go and grab one of our M50s. Once you've got your M50, you're probably going to have bought a fitting kit either from me or from elsewhere. I'm going to show you how my fitting kit works and what to do. So a little thing you can remove, this little bracket under here that's now redundant, so weight reduction, you know, all that shit, get rid of that. You're going to need to replace this fitting here. This is a BMW only part, so you get a brand new one with an O-ring. And then there's this little port on the side that needs to be blocked off. So in my kit, you're going to get a nice little silicone bung, and you just press that on there. And then install that into the manifold itself. Don't worry, it won't be an overly tight fit, but the O-ring will obviously make sure it seals. Make sure that's fully clipped into place, which that is. So that's done. Next up, you're going to want to replace these gaskets. These often end up looking very flat over the years. These ones aren't actually too bad. There's two types available. You can either get the M50 ones, which are single gaskets, they're a bit more expensive, or you can buy these. Again, this will be an option in my kit, you'll be able to buy these. But this is the M52 ones because they're joined up. They still work exactly the same, you just need to cut them and make them individual gaskets. It just works out cheaper to buy 2 of those than it does 6 of these individually. So they need swapping over. The gasket on this side never needs replacing. It never ever seems to deform or anything, even after being 20-30 years old. This manifold come off an E34, so it's 30 years old. And honestly, it's still perfect, it hasn't shrunk. So if you've got an M50 manifold with the M50 throttle body, you can put all of that straight on the car, no problem at all. If, like most people, you've just got the M50 manifold and you'd rather run the M52 throttle body because it's got a simpler linkage on it, then what you can do, again, these are included in my kits, you basically need to make some sort of spacer or adapter. So this particular one, mine bolts straight on there, and then you use your M52 throttle body with the original gasket again, no need to replace that, bolt that up, and that gets your throttle body side done. Obviously your brake booster clips on this guy here. You've replaced the gaskets, this piece is done and installed and that's blanked. This piece here is for your fuel regulator line. So on the M50s and M52s, it's dead common. You'll end up with the line perishing over time. So again, in my kit is a nice black silicone line, push fit. And that's going to hook into this port on here. And then the other end is on the regulator on the fuel rail. So there's a bit of rubber bunk needs putting off there, but that just goes straight on there like so, and then that hooks straight into there, and then that's your fuel regulator line done. Intake air sensor. The M50 one doesn't talk to the M52 ECU, so this sensor is redundant. There's a couple of options you have. The first one is to unscrew this and cut a thread into your M52 sensor. So that's what the M52 sensor looks like. Now, we need this sensor to talk to the ECU. This sensor won't work because it won't work with the M52 ECU. So you can unscrew this, but where the M52 one is a push fit, see it's got a little clip there, whereas the M50 is a screw in. So this won't go straight in there. Now, you can cut a thread into this, but it doesn't really do the job. They tend to be a bit of a shit fit. So if you want to take this out, you can silicone this in there. It's all a bit bodgy, to be honest. I prefer just leave that in there, forget about that. And then when we've got our intake boot, our new intake boot, what we're going to do with a drill bit, don't use a knife, just a drill bit, a small hole, drill a small hole just in here, and then push that in, and it will live just where this O-ring is. You won't get a vacuum leak if you do it nicely, and then that way your temp sensor, it's easy to access, and it's still in the intake system. That's how I would install it. If you don't want to do that, if you think no, that's too bodgy, you could just tuck it under the intake manifold, but obviously the temp sensor is going to read slightly off because it's not actually in the intake manifold. So there's a few ways of doing that. I'm not saying one particular way is best. Probably, ideally, you want to get it back where the original sensor would be, so it's in the manifold behind the throttle body. But yeah, it's a bit of a janky fix. So my method that I've used over the years is just to drill a very small hole in the intake boot and just push it in there. The cable is long enough, you can't see it, so that's how I like to do them. And then lastly, we just need to hook up the idle control valve. So I haven't trimmed this yet, but if you bought one of my kits, you'd end up with something similar like this. And basically, there's our idle control valve. Just a shout out, before you reinstall this, give this a clean. You probably won't be able to see it on the camera, but you should be able to hear this rattle. And if it's not, then it's stuck shut with carbon, so it needs a good clean out with some brake cleaner. And once it's clean, you should be able to hear it rattle. It go da, 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 da. So yeah, we need to get that sorted. Anyway, so this pipe needs to live. We need to get our idle control valve to sit something like that. Right, first things first, then let's get these old gaskets out. Right, you joined me a little while on. So what I've done is replace all these gaskets. Don't use M52 ones because you have to trim off quite a lot of this. So definitely get M50 ones. I'll make sure the website option is for M50 ones. And then that is basically the setup we're going to run, which is super simple. So we've got our new bung from BMW. We then use a silicone joiner to get to the idle control valve. This is very similar to the stock M50 intake pipe, so we basically just replicated that, but rather than buying the BMW one, we've gone for a silicone option. And then for the moment, we're getting from the idle control valve to the intake boot using the stock BMW intake pipe. I haven't quite bolted that to the manifold yet, but just to show you the positioning, that's basically what you want to end up with. So the manifold is almost ready to go back on the car. Obviously we've replaced the silicone hose for the vacuum line, so that's there waiting. Okay, so we can now get the manifold back on. Just remember, as you're placing it back down, before you fit your manifold, ideally stick an airline through it just to make sure there's no dust and crap got in there. Your fuel rail should be fine to just live up, your injector rail should be fine to live up there, but your fuel rail, you kind of need to have, because of the fuel lines are on it, it's not high enough to sort of lean up there, so you kind of need to have that sort of sat roughly in that sort of position. Just because once the manifold is on, you won't be able to get the rail into position otherwise. So just bear that in mind, it sort of needs to be set like that. And yeah, at that point we can now get the manifold in situ. Just make a mental note of where your vacuum line is. So let's turn it upside down. That's fine. Voila, that's our manifold in place. So that's all happy. Obviously that stuff is currently in our way. So we can now bolt the manifold down. Just to remind you, there's the two brackets that bolt the M52 manifold on. They don't fit on the M50 manifold unless you do a bit of fabrication work, but it's really not needed. You'll see in a moment, once this is bolted down, it barely moves. We can now start putting our intake manifold bolts back in. I think they're 11 mils. Right, so the manifold's on. We've just got to put the rail in. We've hooked up the vacuum line for the fuel regulator. So just busy putting the injectors back into the rail. Once all your injectors are in, just give them a wiggle and make sure that they're seated. If any aren't seated, they'll make a click sort of into place. And then once that's all into place, you can add a touch of grease again to the O-ring at the bottom. And then we can seat the injector rail into the manifold. Now there is some trimming that needs to be done before we can do that. So if you look at the injector location, ideally you want to invest in an M50 fuel rail if possible, but they're quite hard to find these days. So if you notice, the bolt holes don't line up, they're slightly off center. That's not the end of the world, but we need to basically remove this bracket where the rearmost lambda sensor sits, because this stops the fuel rail actually being able to see. So to clip the fuel rail in place, I've had to trim a bit of metal off of this front bracket. You can see I've taken the sort of grinder to it that way and flattened it right back to the square edge of the rail. And on this side, I've left the mount alone, but this front edge has had to come off. So just make sure, obviously I've used the grinder, any trimming that you're doing, because the engine technically is still open because the injectors aren't plugged in, make sure you cover the holes. A bit of fettling required, but yeah, you need to just get this rail seated. You'll know when it's seated because you won't be able to see the top of the O-rings. They should disappear into the manifold. And yeah, the height wise, it should be pretty much flush with these bolt holes. Even though they don't line up, it should be pretty level. If you're not going in, as I say, a bit of grease and just give them a wiggle this way. That way won't really do anything. Just a wiggle and a push down. And then that's perfect. So they're seated in there. Happy days. So we do need to make a little bracket in theory just to hold this rail in place. You don't have to, but it's good precautionary. So we'll make that out of a bit of steel in a moment. In the meantime, we can actually clip the injectors back in. There you go, and then that's the injectors clipped in. You've got your van off solenoid just to chuck back in. And then that's all the injectors seated. You've got your lambdas. Unfortunately, we lose the rear bracket when we fit an M50 manifold. There's not much we can do about that. So they'll just have to be neatly tucked where they would live. and stick a cable tie, but the front one we can still use the original mount on the rail. So that's there. That's that side of things done and buttoned up. Around this side, we've got a few things to address. So first and foremost, we have got to figure out one, we've got our dipstick, which we no longer have a mount for. So usually what I would do is just cable tie it to the fuel lines. It's not going to move a great deal, so that's fine. This breather, that needs putting on, and a Jubilee putting onto it. So next up, we've got to make a hole for the temp sensor. So what I've done is use an 8mm drill bit and a nice clean cut. We don't want to tear this boot because obviously that could damage it. It'll tear further later. So an 8mm bit works perfectly, and then we're just going to push that in. And we'll see by the O-ring. So the O-ring actually works as a perfect seal, as you can see in there. And then that's great. That's easy for us to plug into, and we haven't had to piss around with the manifold too much, which is what we want. So once that's done, we can then get the what do you call it? The throttle body gasket on, or adapter. I've cable tied the dipstick, so that's now happy. We do need to plug in our idle control valve before we put the throttle body on, because otherwise access is pretty tight. So we're just going to fit that electrical connection on. So just a bit of fettling there, and then the accelerator cable's happy. That breather line can go back on. Now, if you grab the original bolts that were holding the throttle body on, we're going to put our gaskets. We've got the original M50 gasket still in the manifold, and then we've got our M52 gasket, which is going back into the throttle body. So we've got two gaskets. Now don't be tempted to do this and not use an adapter, it won't seal properly. Then our plate goes on there. That guy goes back on there. And just thread those bolts home. We now need to just button up these last few bits. Firstly, let's plug our throttle position sensor in, and then that's for our temp sensor. So we do need to just hook this intake boot up. So this guy's just going to land on here. Obviously that one nipping up, and we push in our intake boot to idle control valve hose into the intake boot, and then that's pretty much spot on. Now I'm just going to bring you in. So if you look, you can see, although the idle control valve is sort of dangling, it's actually in the perfect place. It's kind of away from everything. This OEM hose got the perfect bend to clear all the throttle cable and stuff like that. So all I would suggest, if you want to, just for peace of mind, is chuck another cable tie just around this and those metal water pipes, just to keep that in place, and then obviously that won't move around. Need to plug in the air temp sensor. Just a note as well, before you drill the hole for the temp sensor, it's worth just roughly fitting the intake boot and making sure you've got the orientation of the sensor right. You don't want it sort of horizontal because it will hit this. I've done that by eye because I've done this a few times, but I'm pretty close. But yeah, you basically want to get it right in the bottom of this, so it's got the space underneath, so it's clear of everything. That is how we fit an M50 to an M52. So pretty straightforward. There is, over the years, there's been more expensive kits that you can buy, which are fancier and do a better job, no argument, but these days they're almost impossible to find, and if you do find one, they come at a premium. So if you've got one of those, mint, happy days. This seems to me like the cheapest, most sensible, non-bullshit option for most DIYers to fit one of these manifolds without a ton of headache or expense. There is a few fitting kits out there that you can use. Not gonna knock anyone's, they're all slightly different. This one is supposed to be as simple as possible. There is better kits out there, but this one is supposed to be simple. There's very little hoses, very little bullshit. It's just eliminate all the crap, and that's what we're left with. So there is a couple of little pieces that we would like to iron out. With this setup, obviously we've blocked the dipstick return, the oil return, and the feed into the manifold. So we are going to get vapors coming out of this rocker cover. So what I will do, I don't yet have a catch tank design to include on the website, but I will work on that. In the short term, as a temporary fix, if you just want to get one of these chucked on, you can just stick the pipe back on, the factory pipe, this guy here, and that will just vent out the vapors sort of next to the alternator. That will be all right for a temporary fix. But in an ideal world, what we want to do is basically convert this. We can use the top half of this pipe, but we want to get some sort of catch tank tucked in somewhere, maybe up here, somewhere, to catch these vapors. But the tank must be vented. It can't be a sealed unit, otherwise you're going to pressurize your engine and then you'll blow a seal. So we do need to sort out a catch tank solution. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to add them to the kit, maybe as an option. So if you want to use your own, if you've got one lying around, or if you want to buy a fancier one, then so be it. And lastly, just to mention that your M52 rocker cover will fit, but fitment is very tight. So I'm not going to fiddle too much with this on camera. You can sort of figure it out. But if you'll notice, it does sit quite high. You will be able to get it to bolt it down using the M52 one, but the fitment isn't great. So in a perfect world, if you wanted to do an M50 mani swap on an M52, you should really use an M50 fuel rail, because then it will sit properly and it will sit on the rail. And also, just to mention that the fuel rail, although it's pushed in place and it won't physically move, it can't really come out because there's so much tension on each of those injectors. It's not bolted down. So we do need a little plate making here to screw that into place, and ideally one here as well. Again, that's something I will include in the kit, but it's not an absolute necessity. So obviously, as the kit is ready, I'll keep adding these pieces on. But that's basically the long and short of how to fit it. I know it's been a bit of a long one, a lot of detailed info, but for those who wanted to do a swap and want a sort of step-by-step foolproof guide, that is how you do it. If you have any questions, you're welcome to right below, but probably best thing to do is just jump on my company website and ping me an email if you've got any setup questions. I'll get the kit added as soon as possible, and yeah, hopefully that'll make your guys' lives much easier fitting these, and also reduce the cost, because they are getting quite expensive, these M50 manifolds. And by the time you bought the manifold and bought a fitting kit, like the only fitting kit that I know in the UK is well over 100 quid now, which is quite expensive in my opinion. With all that in mind, if we can get a kit out, I'm not yet sure how much mine's going to be, but it will be under £100, that's for sure. And try and make this still a feasible upgrade for M52s. So a lot of people these days are jumping into S54s, S50s, because to tweak an M52 is starting to cost quite a bit of money. So if I can help you guys out with a cheaper install kit to make modifying your M52 a bit more accessible, that to me seems like a pretty good idea. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you've got any requests for sort of E36 mods or something similar to this, like a pretty common thing, but like you want a detailed write-up on how to do it, ping me a message and I can look into it and see if I can sort something out. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this one, and thank you for watching. Peace out.